Hello Internet and welcome to the Collective Arcana. We are a channel all about tabletop gaming. My name is Wyatt and today we're going to be talking about the Kineticist playtest results for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So just a couple of hours ago we got the analysis for the latest playtest for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the Kineticist, which is a sort of non-spellcaster who uses a bunch of elemental magical type effects to sort of act as either a striker or utility caster. We'll sort of see how the final version shakes out. But it's a very unique sort of class, and we did a video on the playtest when it first launched and talked a little bit about that and everything. And now what we're talking about today is the analysis that was written up by the developer, Logan Bonner, which is something that Paizo does anytime there's been a playtest. They like to talk about the feedback that they got. They keep things close to the vest, of course. They want to have surprises and everything for the final version, and they don't want to lock themselves into anything if, time or development or whatever steers them a different direction. This is just based on their initial version and what we said about it. This is their sort of analysis of that feedback. So according to Logan Bonner, we got a lot of feedback for this one. Seemed like maybe more than we typically give. And that's good because this is a pretty contentious sort of class that they've offered where, and we'll get to that in a little bit, where there's a whole lot that a lot of people want from it. So the more feedback we get, the better. That's why it's so important anytime Paizo does one of these play tests that you not only test it out, but also most importantly is give them your feedback from it. So let's dive in. Let's talk about, how they're interpreting our responses and get some of the hints of what this class could look like in its final form. The class was apparently pretty highly rated, with the main complaints being sort of what we were expecting, those being the damage being a little bit low, and that's normal for the playtests. They always tend to release them a little bit undertuned. That's by design because it's A, more exciting to buff the final release than nerf it, and B, if the final version is weaker than the playtest version, who's going to buy it? Right? They'll just keep playing the better playtest version. So it's not strange that it's a little undertuned on damage-wise. And also the way that playtests work is sometimes we don't even really know exactly what they're trying to test, which is the interesting thing that they've talked about a lot in some of these previous ones, where they'll say that, or they'll release something and the community will think that their question or, their concern is one place. And then sure enough, they're actually testing a whole different set of parameters with certain things already not, I won't say locked in stone, because if it's really hated, then they'll change it. But, the things that we think are problems are things that they knew going in we were going to think were problems, and they're looking to see how we adjust within the framework of the class to overcome those problems. So, anytime you see a playtest from Paizo, you're going to see these big red flag elements that concern you, and usually those are designed to concern you. So don't freak out about it too much. So one of the other big concerns was the response to the overflow and gather element of the class, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with the playtest, your Kineticist would have to gather their element for one action, and then most of their best abilities would have the overflow trait, which meant that using them would deplete your energy and you'd have to spend another action gathering it, turning most of these 2-action overflows into effectively 3 actions because of the way that it ate up your economy to get back to doing your standard stuff. I and my playtesters and most of the community found this very taxing and not exactly fun, and so Logan confirmed that this is one of the things that would be getting the most adjustments in terms of how this sort of action economy tax, or hopefully lack thereof, works out in the final version. The end result will probably be something that feels a lot less rigid and a lot more able to interact with the 3-action economy and the other abilities that you may pick up on your journey through character building, so that you do not feel like you are stuck in a set rhythm. Part of that is overflow is going to be less common and reserved only for the really potent and powerful abilities. We're not sure what that's going to mean, if it's going to increase any sort of cooldown or anything like that. We do know there will not be resource management as we know it, so there's a good chance that that's going to be the end of overflow, is it's just going to be something that sort of makes you have to gather your element. But the idea is, unlike in the playtest version, those abilities are going to be potent enough to be worth it and be not the standard that you sort of see for all the best things so that you can go entire combats or even perhaps have your entire build without using it. Part of how we know that Gather Element is changing is he mentioned that there would just be sort of this always assumed on type of aura that doesn't necessarily do anything, but just allows you to, fills that role of having that gathered element, which hopefully means you're spending less actions recharging it and only needing to gather element after an overflow versus having to do it at the start of combat or if your hands get unfree and things like that in the playtest version. He also mentioned that a lot of folks, I was one of them, said that gathering element might be a little more interesting or a little less tax feeling if it gave cool rider abilities, say rider effects like the gunslinger and their reload, or the magus and their conflux spells that allow you to recharge or reload, depending on which one we're talking about, and then also get like another action sort of baked in. Or we might see something more like the swashbuckler, who does skill actions and other things that you are incentivized to do, which turn on your panache. So if we do see a version of Gather Element remain in the class, it's probably going to look more like that. Speaking of your elements, you gather those from your gates, and gates sort of got a little bit of attention as well, with Logan stating that the playtest version where you could choose between 1 gate, 2 gates, or all gates is probably not going to survive. And the reason for that is simply that it felt like one was inherently better than the others, but also it felt like it was something that would make it a little hard to build around. Specifically, that being the everything gate. And again, if you're not familiar with the playtest, the gate is just referring to the conduit that you use to tap into the elemental planes. And with each kineticist having at least one, up to several. And the idea here for the final version is that you will get to choose between either starting with 1 or 2 gates, and then as you grow and level, you can expand that out, but you're not locked into being a set type of gate from the get-go. It's something that can grow with your character and change with your character. And if you find in play that you just really like a single element, great. But if you get playing and you find that you're getting a little bored, or you really like some of these other abilities, or just some narrative thing is changing about your character, inspiring you to pick up another element, you are now free to do so versus being locked in at that choice from level 1, which is always better to have options as you grow instead of having to make a big decision like that you can't change at level 1. Next up, Logan confirmed that Constitution is going to stay the key ability score for the class, and based on some of the responses that they got, rather than change that, they're going to sort of make sure that it's more of a focus so that you don't feel like you're being pulled in too many directions ability score-wise. Specifically, he mentioned using Constitution as a damage modifier on some blasts and impulses and things like that, and probably a lot more, which we'll talk about here in a moment. I think this is a good fix. If they're going to stick with Constitution, it definitely needs to be better. I was one of those people that did not want them to stick with Constitution. We'll get towards the end with all the reasons why, because even though they are going with Constitution, that just makes it all the more relevant, all the reasons why I think they need to be careful with it, and so I'm going to give you my input on that towards the end. Next up is the Blast. Logan mentioned that the class isn't really supposed to be focused on single target damage, which is a niche most martials fill, but instead we'll see the final design aiming much more to that area effect, utility type of a thing, which is what most casters struggle to do. So the best way to set this new elemental-themed caster apart is obviously to make it do AoEs and things like that, which most martials are not currently good at. So that's sort of the idea of the niche that it's going to fill. For those of you who really like using your elemental blasts, don't worry. He said that there's going to be some tools to improve that if that's something that you do want to focus on, but they're making sure, they're going to try to make it clear that the blasts and single target damage are not the primary intended goal of the class, just an option to pick up if you want to. He also mentioned it's probably going to function a little more like a cantrip, using Constitution for the attack roll. This is a bit at odds with another statement saying how they want to make impulses feel less like spells, including losing the manipulate trait, except when it makes absolute sense for the description of the ability. Now, at odds or not, I think that both are great directions, and I think that both can be true. You can take some inspiration and also sort of cut some ties elsewhere, particularly that manipulate trait that does feel like, especially with how many reactions it can trigger and things like that, course, concentrate can as well. But it's definitely nice for making it feel like your impulses are not just reskinned spells. So that's a good change. Sort of on this note, Elemental Weapon, which was a favorite in my playtests, this feat will still be present and even expanded upon, and that's a very good thing. On the subject of this comparison between martials and casting, one of the design goals of the Kineticist was specifically to make it simple to play. Logan mentions that most of the classes after the core rulebook have been on the more complex side just to make their gimmicks function. And for that reason, they wanted to build a more streamlined class. So you won't be seeing resource management or other abilities like burn as part of this class, which is going to make it feel both more like a martial, despite how it may look, throwing out elemental area effects and things like that. And I think that's really good, and again, great for a unique niche, but also just really good for this class that should feel like using these elements is effortless. That was really one of their other stated design goals, was making it so that it feels like your Kineticist is able to do things with elements that other classes who can use elements just aren't capable of doing. For that reason, we're going to see that some impulses, probably especially the Overflow impulses, will be more powerful, at least in some ways, than spells of a similar level. The reason for that is because, well, spellcasters can do a whole lot of things in a given day, and the Kineticist is going to be much more limited in the number of things they can do, so those fewer things that they can do need to be better. How this will play out with the unlimited resources versus spellcasters having very limited resources, we'll see. But on the whole, this is a really great design because, for example, what he calls out specifically is the Wings of Air playtest ability, which was a really nice flight ability that the Air Kineticist could access. And he said it just doesn't make sense. To paraphrase him a little bit, he said, it makes sense that a Kineticist who is dedicated to manipulating air can fly better and have a little more mojo in that area than a spellcaster, a wizard who just has all these options and just happened to prepare fly today. And that's great design, and that's very good. Again, it's going to be a little hard to find exactly where to balance between limited resources and limited options with those resources, but I'm sure that they can find that balance. Again, it's about creating a new niche for this class that is not quite a martial, not quite a caster, somewhere in between, but still easy and simple to play. And that sort of leads us into the role, which is, he mentioned that a lot of the responders were not quite confident about what the Kineticist's intended role was, which we sort of touched on when we talked about, the single target versus the area effect. He stated each element will have a clearer identity, and we sort of knew that's sort of the direction they were aiming for, and it makes sense. You would probably want your earth or your metal Kineticist to be more durable, and then your air element or your air Kineticist to be more mobile, things like that. And I like that idea of playing into the themes of the elements. With that said, he still said it was important that the Kineticists have multiple different possible paths. They wanted to have these clear-cut roles that you could play, but also give you room to wiggle out of those clear roles and create non-standard builds, which is, of course, what Pathfinder 2nd Edition is the best at. That's sort of a big selling point to it. So anytime a new class comes around, that's exactly the sort of thing you want to hear. So a lot of good changes. Unfortunately, I'd be remiss, I mentioned earlier, if I didn't say that I think going with Constitution is a pretty big mistake here. I'm sure that they have the tools to make it work, but I think that especially the more that I read through this analysis that was posted, the more that I feel that way. For example, when mentioning the class lacking out of combat options, which was a big point, and one that they said they plan to address and improve upon, they said they weren't really sure how they were going to fix it. And the fact is, it has these out of combat problems because Constitution is not helping with any skill checks. When you spend 4 of your 9 level 1 ability score boosts, and they apply to none of your skill checks and nothing except what is functionally your class DC, as useful as that class DC may be, especially if everything you're doing with it, you're picking up with feats, you only get so many. There's only so much it can do. And by cutting off those 4 ability score points from anything that could affect a skill or outside of combat or even in combat abilities, you are limiting the potential of that class. Full stop. As I said, there are ways to fix this. None of them are great, though, and they come with their own problems. You could do a swap where you replace an ability score for certain things with Constitution, like, athletics, for example, or, whatever may make sense within each element. That's effective. It is effective, but it's boring because it still ties you to the skill checks that they think you should be using with your element, and is potentially going to interact strangely with existing skills and skill feats. Making con do too much is also going to hurt build variety in general, because, if con is your everything, then it may feel a little harder to branch out of con, versus if con is only giving you one aspect of your character and you know that you have to build to other things to make it work, then you're going to leave yourself a little more room and a little more space in the design and the concept. And it's sort of a necessity is the mother of invention sort of thing. If you know that you've got to have high dex to keep your AC up, for example, or high strength to keep your attack up, whatever, that's going to open up new options, versus if everything is con, then you could end up in situations where you're not incentivized to have a high secondary ability score. Another solution that he mentioned specifically was extra starting skills, which looks very good on paper, but without a good ability score modifier, having a bunch of just trained skills at low level, but no ability scores giving you above a +1 or a +2 is still not going to be great. We have set DCs by level in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and with this method, with just a whole bunch of extra trained skills with no ability score to add to them, the Kineticist is going to struggle early on to meet those at-level DCs, a lot more than any other class. And it's one thing to have a bunch of trained skills, but unless they're also going to invest in allowing the Kineticist to get more expert skills, and then more master skills, and then more legend skills, it's going to be the sort of thing where they're going to fall off very quickly, and they're going to quickly lose their effectiveness. That could be balanced with the fact that, once you get to about level 10, the low ability scores of the Kineticist relying on Constitution, you're going to get enough boosts by level 10 and after to start mitigating some of those low ability scores. So it may be enough just at the low levels at creation to do it, but I would be very cautious. I don't think that it'll help, certainly, but I don't think that it's going to be enough. I think that with this method still at low levels, before level 10, half the game, most of the game for a lot of people who don't play higher level, you're going to find that it's stifling. We played for 6 levels with a Constitution-based Legendary Games Kineticist, a different chassis, but the same result of all the players' points had to go to con, and so when it was time to do anything other than roll those attacks, he was struggling to hit on-level numbers. And that may not bother some people, and a lot of people don't build optimally like that, and that's fine. But it's one thing when it's a choice, and it's a very different thing when it's baked into the class that you're going to be bad at skills. The final way would be unique abilities. This is the most interesting solution, but it will limit you to only thematic utility, which is something that a lot of these are going to solve. Is you're probably still only going to be good at the specific things they expect you to be good at, which is a very Dungeons & Dragons 5e of, this is your class, these are the skills you can be proficient in. You can't even try to be proficient in these other skills unless you invest a whole bunch of other stuff to do so. That's not great design, and in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, it's very glaring design. So, again, it could work. The other problem with this is that Logan has mentioned specifically that they don't have maybe as much book space as they would hope to. And that's, a very real part of the business is, budgeting for page space, making sure you're fitting everything in that you want in while fitting under the budget, because, sometimes a difference of 3 or 4 pages could be a huge, massive price increase depending on how they gate the page count at the publisher that they're using. Publisher is probably not the right term, but, whoever is actually manufacturing those books, they set where those cutoffs are, and that is a lot that determines what the final page count is on these books. And so if you're having to spend pages and pages on fixing the out-of-combat utility of the class that would be functionally close to non-existent by just allowing it a regular sort of skill bonus progression that most people can expect, that's not great. That doesn't feel good to me. That's exactly something that I mentioned in my first thoughts on it, was that the only way you can make Constitution work is by spending a lot of resources, time, and page space word count to make it work. And it sounds like that is a very real problem that they're having. How big of a problem? I don't know. But the thing that frustrates me is it could have not been a problem at all. And then, spending less space making Constitution work would have been more unique things that we get. He specifically states in his write-up that they may not have room for some of the cool ideas that they have because they're already sort of up against the wall on it. And, it doesn't feel good to say, I told you so, and I'm sure, they were already down this road well before we saw it and play tested it, and I highly doubt enough important people were looking at my video or cared what I had to say for it to matter. But it does kind of bum me out. Furthermore, I promise I'm close to done, but furthermore, none of these solutions that I proposed, and maybe they have others, but none of them will actually help you with the other big problems, which are how it interacts with the system as a whole and other elements of the game design. Outside of your base class, Kineticist is going to struggle to qualify for multi-class archetypes because they are so dependent on Constitution and nothing else is as a prerequisite or as a supplement to anything that anything else does, except the Barbarian, who, because all of your impulses have the Concentrate trait, you cannot use them together. So that's not great. There's just zero synergy with Constitution across the system for archetypes, skills, and feats, and even items, which is another thing he sort of mentions. So, again, it just feels like they wanted to check off the box of we have a Constitution class, or maybe it's just that it was a secret cow from first edition, but a lot of people wanted it, and I don't think a lot of people understood what it meant for the design and powered budget. I mean, if you look at the thief rogue who gets to add their dexterity to damage, that's just a fraction of what they would have to do in terms of ability score replacements for Constitution to function. And even that is the entire budget of the rogue subclass of thief. For functionally, that's it. So that should tell you how much powered budget, how much of the class's abilities are, and its power cap is going to be tied to just making that function. Just for a gold star that says we did Constitution. I don't know. One more thing, the drained condition. I was just thinking about this. The drained condition is going to be nasty on Kineticist because normally if you get the drained condition, you're like, well, my offense is still good. I'm fragile now, but my offense is still good. But for Kineticist, it's a double whammy. It's like getting hit with enfeebled and drained for a fighter, or drained and stupefied for a caster. Don't fight undead, Kineticist. Don't do it. Other than that, rant over. I apologize. Thanks for sitting through that. Other than the Constitution thing, I think there's a lot of really good news here. It really, as usual with Paizo, they did a great job listening to the community. Even the Constitution thing, that's because I don't like it, but that's because they listened to you. They said that the majority of people liked the Constitution. I don't like it. What do I know? Right? Most people liked it. They're going to make it work. And that's the great thing about these play tests is that we get to get our hands on these classes and decide how they're going to proceed, and that they listen to us. Boosting the damage, increasing the out-of-combat tools, those are by far the most troubling parts for me and my players when we were doing the play tests. I think these changes are going to make the Kineticist much more fun and impactful, both in combat and out, of course. And if they can solve the AC issues that the class has, which were also pretty troubling, which I think having fully fleshed out earth and metal and wood is probably going to lead to some pretty durable Kineticists. I'm not really worried about it. I'm sure they're going to solve it. But solving these are going to make this class very cool and unique and a great addition to the game. One thing that I'm really excited about is the multi-class dedication for it. I think that the blasts, and especially that elemental weapon, at least it's got my gears turning. I think a lot of people are going to find really cool builds to work around just being able to summon this energy weapon like Kuwabara from Yu Yu Hakusho, or almost like a lightsaber for a more common sort of reference. And I think that, that's, again, it's opening up cool new concepts just with the archetypes. So I'm very excited to see what they do with it. I also hope that we see a lot of good synergy with the monk for obvious, Avatari reasons, which I think good chance, but we'll see just based on how they're saying that the standard blasts will be even less like unarmed attacks. And I get it because flurrying with some of those blasts, at the range that they had, I get why they're not treated as unarmed blasts. But it would have been real cool. It would have been real cool. Would have been broken on some builds, very easy to exploit, but it would have been real cool. In the end, this analysis didn't quite alleviate all of my concerns, but it does make me excited to see what they come up with the final version. It sounds like they're still a little less solid on the final version than they usually are this far after the playtest, but that's hardly surprising. The Kineticist was one of the weirdest classes in first edition, and more than that, it was very popular. And when something is very popular, that's a lot of people that touched it and a lot of people who are going to have different parts of it that they're excited about. This pressure is further exacerbated because many parts of the Kineticist, the popular parts, the parts people loved, have been taken up elsewhere in the system. The at-will elemental attacks are pretty much covered by the better scaling cantrips in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I mean, every caster has unlimited number of fire or electric or air attacks that they might want. Tanky caster got stepped on a little bit by the summoner. Very different sort of build, plenty of play space remaining there. But it's still worth talking about compared to the old edition of summoner that wasn't quite that sort of, didn't quite have that staying power and those fun exploits to keep yourself standing. The Elemental Boom is the domain of several Druid orders and the Elementalist archetype. Elemental Fist and Elemental Stance Monks cover a lot of the elemental bending avatar type flavor of the Kineticist. And even Psychic with Oscillating Wave, making devastating at-will elemental caster, who even gets a burn mechanic in Strain the Mind. So there's a lot of what people loved about the Kineticist already prevalent everywhere else in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. That means that the 2e Kineticist sort of is almost starting from scratch, which, we see a lot of the things like, the burn and the sort of amps, which were also sort of taken, for lack of a better term, but this modifying your blasts as they come out, versus the 2e version where we have distinct set blasts and what they do, impulses they're called. In 1e, you sort of had one thing and then you modified it as it went, was a big part of the game design there. So, we're seeing this thing that is sort of built ground up for 2nd edition with very little, aside from the theme and flavor and the constitution, that they felt they needed to pull forward. That means that, like the Inventor and to a lesser extent the Thaumaturge, it's going to be one of the most uniquely 2nd edition classes in the game, and that's good. We have seen before with those two classes in particular that when the designers get to stretch their legs and don't feel like they're shackled by pre-existing concepts. How true that is for the Kineticist is hard to say, but when they get to stretch their legs like that, it works out very well, and I'm excited to see more of it. I'm excited to, not just with the Kineticist, but we're running out of 1st edition classes for them to port over that don't have some sort of coverage already. It's like Inquisitor, Shifter, Shaman, that's really about it, which, is still several years worth of content if they're doing one per year, which I think is a good standard for them to start aiming for now that we're past that initial hump of getting everything ported over so that people can not feel like they're missing out by switching over from 1e and all of its plethora of options. But it's a weird thing to think about in terms of where do we start going once they have finished porting everything from 1st edition, and we're starting to see that a little more with Kineticist because so many of its things were already poached in previous releases. I know. I was pretty negative on some of this, on some parts of the class, Constitution, but I'll be very happy to be surprised, and I usually am. It certainly wouldn't be the first time that the brilliant folks over at Paizo have proved me wrong. I had a lot of concerns about the Psychic, which turned out to be one of my favorite classes. I had a lot of concerns about, what was the other one? The Magus, the Playtest Magus, I did not love. Or Summoner, for that matter. But the final versions are awesome, and I have a feeling this is going to be the same sort of thing. So that's it. Have you read through the document? It's not terribly long. I appreciate you listening to me, but you can go and get it straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. We'll put a link down in the description. What do you think of the changes? What did you think of the playtest? Do you think that this is going in the right direction, the wrong direction? Come on over to our Discord and talk to us about it. We'd love to hear from you there. You can tell me how wrong I am about the Constitution thing. I'm not. I know that I'm not. They may fix it, but I'm still not wrong. But, just... I'm excited to see it. Are you excited to see it? And what do you hope will be the next class that we see? Or what do you hope to see in, we'll talk about this more as we get closer to the release of that book, but what else do you hope is in Rage of Elements? Could be anything. All right, thanks so much for sticking it out. I really appreciate it. Welcome to the collective. See you next time.